Hello, welcome to the Journey of Grief, Becoming Us Without Them. I'm Barbara Field, a licensed marriage and family therapist in Sacramento, California, and I specialize in treating trauma and addiction and attachment and grief. And I started this channel as just sort of a resource for people that are grieving or people that work with people who are grieving. So you could sort of hear the voices of people who are sharing similar losses and the voices of a variety of kinds of therapists. So you can decide if therapy might be a good idea for you in your grief journey. And today I've invited Rosemary O'Connor to be with us. And so, how about if you introduce yourself and tell us about your work as it relates to people in grief?
Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Barbara. It's fun to be with you here. And yeah, I'm Rosemary O'Connor, and I've been a certified life recovery and relationship coach for, gosh, over 20 years now. And I'm the Hazelden author of A Sober Mom's Guide to Recovery. And, as it relates to grief, I feel like we're in life, we're always grieving something. And yes, my specialty is working with either people suffering from addiction and or their families. And how it relates to grief, the thing, and I've been sober for over 26 years too. So, I like to share a lot of my own experience and people I've helped along the way. And in terms of when we give up, drugs, alcohol, or whatever is killing us, it's we have to grieve the loss of that. Like for me, it was alcohol. And I love how you said in the beginning, I didn't know kind of what your tagline was, but did you say becoming us without them? I love that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that literally just is like, and I think kind of in life, it's like, yeah, becoming ourselves without all the other things we grab onto, and that bring us down. And yeah, so grieving, for starters, when someone's new in recovery, the loss of like their companion, whether it was alcohol or drugs, for so long. It's kind of like, how do you be? how do you be in this world without that? I mean, kind of, I'm sure that must have been similar to losing your husband.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, it's your companion all day long. It's
Yeah.
basically all you think about. You can be sure it'll do what you want it to do when you want it to do it, which you can't necessarily say that about a husband. And so you
Mhm.
really miss it.
Or drugs or alcohol. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it's, and also when I heard, when you said that, in terms of and learning to kind of more be with ourselves. And I think for like drugs and alcohol, well, I know for me, I didn't really know who I was. I mean, I got sober when I was 37 years old and a single mom of three young kids that were 2, 5, and 8. And, it, that was my crutch, the alcohol. And so I feel a lot of like grief journey is the healing of the loss, but also becoming me without that.
Right. Because you've done everything with in an altered state and
Yeah,
still feeling your feelings, navigating your relationships, your work, your parenting, every part of you,
yeah,
every single part of you
yeah.
has to figure out how to do all that without alcohol.
Right, right. And, over the years, because of my book, A Sober Mom's Guide to Recovery, I've worked, of course, with a lot of mothers. And then the other big, excruciating loss is, that many women have lost their children due to their drinking and using. And that is, I don't know. I mean, that's why I got sober because I was afraid I was going to lose my children. I and many women cannot stay sober once they've lost their children. I mean, I see definitely have helped women who have, and eventually the children have come back. But that grief,
Yeah. And the
it,
shame of it.
yeah,
And just, that children create a lot of chaos, and chaos is another addiction. It's another distraction. And so if you've lost your drugs or alcohol and then your children, and suddenly you're all alone, when my husband died, just the alone thing, the empty house, the empty, silent car. Well, same
mm,
thing. You're sober, you're not using your crutch, and you're surrounded by nothing.
yeah, the emptiness, like you talked about, the emptiness. Yeah, yeah. And I know in recovery we talk about just that kind of w- wound inside of all of us, the emptiness. And I think I know for me that's what I used alcohol to fill. And I think the emptiness for me has had been there for many, many years. And I looked to so many things outside myself, people, places, and things to fill that. And um, what I learned is to find a higher power, because that's really the only thing for me that can replace that. And and yet, a higher power to me is where I find joy, and it's in the little things like my grandkids and just dogs and nature and people, and that where you can, yeah, feel that beyond. It's like that's what for me fills that emptiness, if that makes
Our
sense.
nervous systems need connection and relationship to thrive. We were
Yeah,
never, we're not, our nervous system won't thrive alone. You need oxytocin that you get from relational interactions.
yeah,
And so when we've taken on something else and cut ourselves off from those nurturing relationships, and then we let go of whatever it is, and there are no nurturing relationships. That's the beauty of a good 12-step meeting is people
yeah,
see you, they understand you, they hear you, they hug you.
yeah,
It's just getting some of that oxytocin healing back in there. So it's not just any 12-step meeting. You can't go to a meeting with 300 people, sit in the
yeah,
back row and get a whole lot out of it.
yeah,
But meetings where people actually engage in an effective way, a sponsor that helps with some of that reparenting stuff, that
yeah.
kind of um, learning to be with humans in an environment with people who get you in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That well, and I know they say, addiction is the opposite of addiction is connection, and I think as humans we all are seeking connection, and which is I think it's why it's so devastating when we lose something we love, like a loved one or the alcohol. Um, it's that we're by nature as humans we yearn to connect.
Yeah, and it's really hard when someone loses their children because they say, "No, I love my children more than anything." But people judging them would say, "Seriously, well, then why are we here?"
Yeah,
Because you appear to have loved your alcohol or drugs more than your children,
yeah,
and that's why we're here.
yeah,
So losing your children can be that opportunity to finally find yourself in a way and complete yourself in a way where you actually can choose your children. You
yeah.
actually can love your children well, and you actually can form an actual attachment to them.
Right, right. Yeah, healthy one for sure. A healthy one. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about I come seeking services from you. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, over the years, it's always ebbs and flows and changes. But typically I do the coaching sessions, and it's normally all via Zoom, FaceTime, phone. And I just want to make sure I'm the right person that can help someone. So I'll do, an assessment. Hey, how can I help you? What is it that, what would you like to work on with me? And just see if I'm the right fit. So normally, again, this is all normally because I don't have anything that one size fits all. I've written tons of different curriculums for different situations over the years. Like, I started as a professional life coach, and then a recovery coach, and then relationship coach, just kind of. And so, yeah, people work with me for a minimum of 12 weeks. And, I help them get what they want, live the life that they want. So it's all different. I mean, some people might come, hey, I want to lose weight. Okay. Or, hey, I'm having problems with my partner or my kids, or, hey, I want to go back to school or get a new job. And so, I'm not a therapist. I don't do the deep dive work. I'm more about, moving people forward in their life. So I guess a lot of the work I really do is a lot of, self-esteem building. A lot of people, women are coming to me with, want healthier communication skills. But so I think when it comes down to it, it's all about helping them understand why they do what they do that's maybe harmful to themselves, and then teach them like practical in the moment tools to make healthier choices for themselves, if I had to sum it up.
So then, um, how do you see that when they start with the practical stuff, give me a list, tell me what to do. But when you remove the chaos and you remove the substances, your body just naturally starts to heal, and it's going to right away start into that grieving of the losses. So what does that look like? What do you see? How can you tell somebody has started to mourn the loss of their life?
Yeah, yeah. Well, for some, it kind of the manifestation of it is just no motivation. They can't get off the couch. Um, or maybe it's just that they're so overwhelmed. So, like, I believe in like just baby steps. Just literally the baby steps add up. Okay, how about we're going to hang up and you're going to go get in the shower, and you're going to then call me back and we're going to eat some breakfast together. I mean, it can be literally that simple. Or for a lot, especially moms, they're overwhelmed, and maybe they're a single mom and they're working and they've got these kids. It's a lot of one of the exercises I have them do is, in their head, there's like, oh, I have 1,000 things to do. So it's a 3-column list. Okay, write down everything you think you have to do. And then what's like earth-shattering if you don't do it today. And then because I think so many of us women, especially in recovery or maybe in the world, we're so codependent that on our that to-do list is a lot of things that really other people should be doing for themselves, like their teenagers cleaning their own room, right? Or making their own lunch or, you know, um, and then the list that really doesn't matter. I hope that answers your question. I kind of forget the question at this point.
So, so that's how you help people just get started with the things they need to do.
Yeah,
And then, so initially the grief looks like that inertia.
yeah.
And so how do you help people talk about those losses or notice those losses? Just honor that I'm grieving, and it changes how I think and how I feel and how I act.
Yeah. How do I help people? Hmm. Gosh, it's so different. You know how you've been doing something for so long? I guess I'm also pretty intuitive. So, it's just about asking questions or, because I think there's a lot of things we're similar. Like, it can be a lot of times underneath it is it, I mean, I know for moms a lot, it's the guilt, the shame. So, asking them questions. So, you know, I think you're parenting from guilt. Sounds like you're overdoing it, trying to make up for, you know, um, and then the shame comes into it. thinking that they are a bad mom. Well, we can't change the past. What can you do today? A lot of times with moms, I will be, I have them do an exercise at the end of the day. Tell me 5 things that you did do well as a mother, right? And they can't think of one. And I'll say, did you get them to school? Did you make sure they ate breakfast? Did you tell them you loved them? Did you not yell? I think we come into recovery with 0 to no self-esteem. And so it's really helping them learn to know that, they're not bad people. They just have a really horrible, bad disease. And it's definitely the baby steps.
So I got into a coaching appointment with you and
Mhm.
we set up some goals for the week or for the time between now and my next coaching appointment with you. And I'm enthusiastic, I'm committed, I feel confident about the goals we've set up. I get to the next session, I haven't done a single thing. What do you do?
Absolutely. Of course, that happens all the time, all the time. So, ask things like, well, what got in the way? Oh, well, I was so big. I know I said I was going to go take a walk, but my kid's this, my kid's that, and da 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 da. Da, da, da. Okay, well, what's one thing we can do today? Or maybe the goals we set out were too big. Or maybe they were just maybe telling me something that they thought I wanted to hear, you know? So we just, again, not the shaming, just kind of just digging under. So what do we think got in the way? Sometimes literally, like if one of the goals was going to be to walk, okay, let's get up. I'm putting my shoes on. Let's get outside. We're going to coach and walk. Yeah.
Great. And
Yeah.
so it sounds like it's pretty customized to each person and their level of functioning.
Oh, absolutely. It has to be. Yeah. Yeah. And that's again, sometimes when people, how do you do it? Or what do you do? Or, again, I used to have templates, but because I've been doing this for so long, it kind of go with the flow. I use my intuition or motivating, or a lot of times I'll say, well, I don't know. What do you think? Because I just help people find their answers, you know. And then a lot of women will want me to give them their answers. I don't have your answers. I'm going to help you find your answers.
So, how do people find you? Where do your referrals come from?
Word of mouth, word of mouth. A lot of treatment centers, a lot of therapists, family member, it's all because again, I've been doing this for so long. It's all word of mouth. Sometimes people will say, someone will referred me, and I don't even know who that someone is, you know. Yeah, yeah.
So, say more about how coaching is different than therapy.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Or how is coaching different than sponsorship too? Um, so I don't do the deep dive. I'm, so someone might come up, they might have some maybe traumatic experience come up. They might start sharing something with me that, whether it was maybe, they were molested as a kid, or maybe, something. I will say, that's something that you really need to talk to your therapist about. Thank you for sharing that with me. And I literally, I don't go out of my scope. And so if they don't have a therapist, I've often told people, I can't work with you unless you're going to see a therapist because this keeps coming up. This is definitely what's getting you in the way, and I'm not that person to take you. Like, I'm not EMDR. I'm a coach. So, um, and a lot of times that they will be working with actually a therapist, and especially newly in recovery, if they will sign a release for either their psych, because I do some case management work too. So they might be working with a psychiatrist and a therapist, and I have them sign releases so I can call their other people on their treatment team because, a lot of times I will you know, I will say, how was your appointment with your therapist? And then they will say, oh, it was great. But the therapist will have called me or I've called therapist. Hey, she hasn't showed up for the last 2 sessions, or hey, did you change your medication? Oh, or they'll say they changed their medication. I'm like, you really need to call your psychiatrist. So I'll be on the phone with the psychiatrist. Hey, she let me know, and they've signed a release for sure. But so mine is literally practical in the moment tools of what you can do right now. So also when they're working with me, yes, we have a weekly session, but also they can call me anytime, pick up the phone, a quick text, or hey, I had a fight with my boyfriend, or hey, my kids are driving me crazy, or whatever. So I can really help them. I do this exercise where they do see why they do what they do, this whole process. So, and the harmful behavior. So I will get them back into, okay, let's get into that healthy, like it's a redo. We have the healthy do's and the unhealthy do's. So it's really about, I'm hoping I'm answering your question. I just don't do the deep dive into the real the deeper stuff.
You just do practical, like goal setting and what's happening right now
Yeah,
and what are we going to do next? And
exactly.
what are you
Exactly.
learning about yourself that helps you understand why you didn't do anything you said you were going to do?
Right, right. What's getting in the way? Yeah, yeah,
That's great. So then when you're working with someone and you realize that they have so much trauma and loss that it really is blocking their ability to move forward.
yeah.
How do you find that line where it's time to make sure they're working with a therapist?
Yeah, and I'll just keep nudging them. And I will, I often said, I really can't help you. And I think what I'm really good at and what I know I'm known for is um, I'm very compassionate and I'm very intuitive, and I think people connect to me pretty easily. And and so I find that I can build the trust pretty quickly, and and I'll just and so I'll make a referral, or and I'll they might not want to, and I'll say, well, let's just get Barbara on the phone. Why don't you just let's just set up with the call with Barbara. Why don't you just meet Barbara? I think you'll really like her. She's helped many people like yourself go through these things. And then you can come back to me if you want, and we can do it together. Or again, because I don't want to overwhelm them too. Like sometimes I'll get people out of treatment. Oh, they've got, 8 providers they're working with. I'm like, well, why don't you come back to me in a month? Or, hey, we can do this. But, you know, I just want to help people. I want them to get the right help. So I just keep encouraging them.
A great idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's all we can do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you notice blocks people's progress the most?
Mm. Again, it depends on the client. Guilt and shame. Guilt and shame. Low self-esteem. You know, um, yeah, I mean, that's the guilt and shame and I'm talking people new in recovery, or sometimes they just can't get out of their perspective that they're in. They can't see any other options. Um, yeah. What do you think? I'm curious.
I'm sure guilt and shame are huge.
Yeah.
Everything I've did that I shouldn't have done, or everything I haven't done that I should have done. I knew better. People told me all that self-recrimination,
Yeah.
all those voices in there that basically say you suck and you always will. And it's
Yeah.
really hard to move forward from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I do a lot of work on the thinking, helping people change their thinking process, their thinking patterns, the limited thinking. Um, I believe it starts in our mind. I really think it all does. It all starts in our mind and helping people change their thinking. I mean, it's the old saying, you call a kid stupid so many times, they're going to think they're stupid. Well, now I'm working with grown adults and they think they're stupid because they've been repeating that same message.
The story you tell yourself definitely affects your outcome.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, our minds are
So
amazing,
how
amazing
do
things.
you, so sometimes, you get the I'm perfectly fine person. So how do you help people who are big balls of guilt and shame come out of that perfectly fine space without using guilt and shame?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I love that. Without using guilt and shame. Well, I was one of those fine people. I'm fine. Meanwhile, I'm not coming home with my kids drinking and I'm, leaving them with 10-year-old babysitters to go drinking and just trying to keep that big smile on their face. And I usually will just bring it back to, well, I know I think of just different clients, but because a lot of people, when I'll ask a question that really kind of, they'll laugh about something that's not funny. That I mean, they're using humor as a block to to not feel, basically. And I'll just repeat to them like what they told me. I'm like, "Do you think that's funny? Ah, that must have really hurt you." Kind of just mirroring back. And, oh yeah, I'm fine. It's all good. Oh, okay. So just curious, how can I help you today? If it's all good, then I remember I said one time, then you know what? I said to this one client, I said, well, then you know what? I don't think I can help you. You're good. And then she just started bawling, just broke down. I don't know. I think it was that intuitive thing to say or do, or just being honest. I'm like, well, if you're fine, then I can't help you. What's not fine? What would you, or even, what would you like better than fine?
Great way to reframe it.
Yeah, a lot of times, I'll even use, how you doing on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being nothing and 10, I'm top of the world. And
What does success look like how does someone say, okay, I think I'm ready to launch?
you mean, and coaching or,
Yeah, and coaching, like, so you get to
yeah,
the end of the 12 weeks.
yeah,
So there's the time thing,
yeah,
but at the end of 12 weeks, some people still need a little more.
yeah,
And so what does a person look like? Like if I could had a magic wand and I could just bonk you on the head and you're at the end of the 12 weeks and it's all good.
yeah.
What do I have at the end of the 12 weeks that I don't have at the beginning of the 12 weeks?
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's one of the questions I ask before we start, or if they're just calling to get some more information, I will ask them. Um, so we're at the end of our 12-week sessions, 3 months down the road. What would you like to have said has happened? So a lot of times that can be a starting point. But for what actually has happened for, oh my God, the thousands of clients I've worked with, it's completely different. Completely, depending on what they're, and many people do extend, or many people will be done with, say, the 12 weeks, and then maybe they'll go to every other week, or maybe they'll want to check back in with me and come back for what we call a tune-up. I mean, I've got clients I've been working with for 3 years, 5 years. Um, um, yeah, I coach a company right now. I've been coaching her employees for 5 years now. So it's, it's different, but it looks completely, someone might have moved the mark from a 0 to a 1. Someone might have moved the mark from the 0 to a 12. It, it's just completely different. But
But it
I
really
would
probably
say that,
depends on their readiness and their capacity for
yeah,
change.
yeah, yeah, all of that. Yeah. Some people take leaps and bounds. Some people just, you know, take baby steps, baby steps. But like so I had a session with a client this morning and I've been working with her all year. And this was a young gal that, no motivation, very codependent in her relationship. Um, you know, it, so, yeah, yeah, just anyhow. And in the year, like when I started with her, she was working 1 day a week in huge debt, um, so codependent in the relationship and all of her relationships. And so today the session was she was almost out of debt. She actually had money saved, and she's 24 years old. Yeah, 24. Yeah. Um, she has a friend that's moving. Instead of buying her plane ticket, she's taking her to the airport. She started exercising again. And again, back to some of your questions, she hadn't exercised since our last. She had set a goal of twice a week. So she hadn't achieved those. Okay, well, what do you want to do for this week? So today she's going to exercise at 3 o'clock and she's going to text me when she's done. So, she had made just in a year, because I always like them even to kind of look back at their success, always, because that motivates us. It's a big motivator to continue. But, again, this has just been working with the client once a week, and we've been working together all year, and she's made some huge stride. So, you can tell the personality change. Like she's so much more confident. And I mean, she could barely this was a client that could barely get out of bed. Literally. She was that one that I said, okay, why don't you just get up and shower and call me back? You know, now her house is cleaned, and you can see the light come on, and that's just the best.
It is the best.
Yeah,
Okay, on the opposite end of that,
yeah,
so in my world, it's unethical of me to keep seeing someone that's not benefiting from the services.
yeah,
So I have to have that conversation. It doesn't look like I'm helping you, and I can't keep taking your money if I'm not providing you with service.
right.
And so if things don't change, maybe in the next session or two, we're going to need to talk about maybe sending you to find another therapist who might be able to be more effective with you. So how does I can't take your money if I'm not helping you look in your world?
Yeah, I'm very much the same. You know, I didn't get into this business to be rich. I don't think anybody, if you are, you're in the wrong business. But and I think because one of the things I know I do really well is I am a big cheerleader. I was a cheerleader as a kid. I'm a big cheerleader. And if I mean I've said flat out many times, I just can't help you anymore, or the client that's not showing up for the sessions, I, you've got to be willing, and it's very early on when we create the alignment with the, I'm very clear on that, and it's in my contract that, if you're not showing up, if I don't want to waste your time or money or my time or money.
Right. Okay, so at the end of my videos, I always ask people for their 1 minute wisdom. So if everyone ignored everything we've talked about the whole
Yeah.
time, and you could just send them out of here with one thing about the process of grieving your way through recovery to sobriety and joy, what
Yeah.
is the one thing you want people to take out of here?
Yeah, it doesn't matter how many times you fall down. It just matters how many times you get back up.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much
Ah,
for
thank
doing
you.
this. And
Thank you,
I'm going to
Barbara.
stop the recording real quick,
Okay.
and we'll see you later.